Happy Saturday. Welcome to the Marketing Madmen. Tripp Jobe and Nick Constantino here live from the Battery. And, we're going a different tack today.
Yeah.
It's going to be fun.
Yeah, we are. I don't want to say it's a controversial topic, but in marketing is one of the things that I find people skimp on that don't know it. And look, we're talking about photography here.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's introduce. So we have Mike Moon with us, who is a veteran photographer, but in not the instances you think when you think photography. Not like a 21-year-old pretty girl who's like, I'm a photographer, and just goes by and starts shooting people. And people are like, you're pretty, let's hang out. And that's how she gets.
This is not cell phone selfies we're talking about and Instagram influencers.
But and don't even get me down that rabbit hole, because as good as somebody who takes some appreciation of my really good camera, anyone who thinks that the cameras on your phone are close enough to what a good camera can do has never used a real camera before.
I'm looking forward to this. My ex's father was a photographer, and I actually helped him sell his business when it was time to retire, and got to see the differences between his work, and then of course when our wedding was done, he had to subcontract it out. So you learn a lot when you're in the family has a business.
My aunt had a negative room where she would, the dark room where she would go and she would develop the photography herself. And again, that's what we talked about in the previous show. That's like that bridge millennial. Yeah. Like, what 21-year-old has seen someone develop film at a base? Zero of them. So, all right. So Mike, let's start. I want to start with the military. And I want to start with that because the position you had, one, you mentioned someone that's very, very in the lexicon of conversation right now, same position, but I think you probably learned a lot from there that led to the rest of your career. So talk about the military career, talk about what you did, and talk about some of the situations that you were put in.
Awesome. Okay. So I was a combat correspondent, which is a 4341 in the Marine Corps. That's the MOS. And it's the same MOS that J.D. Vance had. Mm-hmm. So there's been a lot of talk about whether or not J.D. Vance was in combat and what our role was, because our role was titled combat correspondent, but we weren't always necessarily in combat. So like him, I served a different time than him, but like him, I was not in combat. I served in 92 to 2000. So I got in right after the Gulf War, and I got out right before 9/11. So my role would have been the same as Joker in Full Metal Jacket, exactly the same job actually. In a combat situation, I would have been assigned to a unit, and I would have been out in actual combat, capturing photographs and documenting stories about the Marines, which end up going to their hometowns and to their hometown newspapers.
And that's what I was going to ask you before we go. So this is probably a role that has existed in the military for a long time, I imagine.
Yes,
right?
it has,
okay,
yeah.
so what do you know about its inception? Was the purpose to make sure if somebody passed that they had why did this exist, and how seriously is it taken when you go out? Because it sounds like this is very regimented. This is part of every battalion that goes out. There's a specific purpose. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what you were doing, talk about why it existed and what the role was meant to be.
Okay, so there's about 300 Marines who are combat correspondents. So it's a pretty tight job. There's not a lot of opportunities for it. I went in with a guarantee of it. I kind of looked it up and then did my research and stuff. But it's Ernie Pyle is kind of one of the more famous ones. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of where the military, all of the services, they have photographers specifically, but then they have correspondents, which are people who we train in photography, we train in broadcast journalism, print journalism, and public relations. So we end up working for a newspaper. There's always a newspaper or magazine assigned to each military installation. Usually end up being a reporter for them or an editor, something like that. Then as we advance our careers, the second half of my career, I was more involved in public relations. So then we basically are PR office on the base. I was in El Toro, California. I was in Iwakuni, Japan. I was in Darwin, Australia. Things like during the presidential election of '96, I think it was, with Clinton and Dole, we were responsible for every time they would fly in and out of LA in order to do press junkets, things like that. We would meet him at the flight line. We'd take pictures. We do a story about it, grip and grins, things like that. So it's an important role because it's used to promote the military. It's basically public relations. And
when you talk about, you took millions, hundreds of thousands of pictures.
Yeah.
How many of those pictures are ever seen by the public?
Oh my gosh, not very many. I mean, we shot black and white Ilford film back then. I was working on a Canon F1, which is a manual camera. We went to Advanced Photojournalism School, which was in Indianapolis, Indiana. It's in Fort Meade, Maryland these days. And it's a joint service school. So there's about less than 10 Marines there, along with, Air Force and Coast Guard and Army, all of it. And so we all kind of went together. And some of us ended up going and being broadcasters on radio stations overseas. Some of us ended up being on television stations overseas, like English version television stations. And then I was always interested in the print and writing. So I ended up being a reporter responsible for 3 stories a week. It was really cool. I was independent. I could assign myself to a unit. I could call up somebody, be like, where are you going? What are you doing? I could tag along. I could write stories about the Marines, take their pictures, things like that.
So you have quite the unique perspective on how the military operates.
Exactly. I got to learn about whatever department, whatever group I wanted to learn about and deploy with them directly. And I usually got to live in the officer quarters in the more chill areas.
There's so much we're going to go into, but I want to, this is an important one. So what do you think is the most misunderstood part of what the public thinks of the military? You saw behind the scenes, you saw a part of this.
Oh, I think that's easy.
What is the most misunderstood part of the United States military? And it could be then, it could be now. What part do you think people just don't get?
There's 2 things. One is that they don't take just anybody. I mean, the Marine Corps specifically is very elite. Nobody's in the Marine Corps who doesn't want to be a Marine. They never have a problem recruiting. They never have a shortage of recruits. The Marine Corps specifically. The other services, maybe sometimes. The Marine Corps is more elite. It's smaller. The other biggest one is that people choose to be there, and it's like a job that we choose to do, and we enjoy it and we're proud of it. So when we're fighting a war, we don't have to believe in the war necessarily. We believe in our role, and we take orders from the commanding chief, the commander in chief. So unless it's an illegal order, we will do it, and we don't have to judge.
They're not documenting it anyway.
It's
an illegal order. It's not making its way to the public.
We're talking about documentation. Exactly. No, but to be honest with you, the public relations aspect of it was important because there was a lot of times when, like in Los Angeles, the Hollywood would do a story or a movie, like they filmed Independence Day when I was there. So I got to take Will Smith out on an F-18 for a test flight back then because he was going to play a pilot, and so we would be the ones that would kind of coordinate that with as a liaison between the military and the civilians. So I think it's misunderstood, number one, how much coordination there is, especially in movies, things like that, between the military and Hollywood, and that there are representatives that have to sit in the middle there. We also have to do press releases when bad things happen. Believe it or not, like a Marine murdered his wife and put her body in the back of a car at LAX, and suddenly now we're getting calls from press releases, so we're writing press releases nonstop. So there's a lot of us having to control the information. I think that's what J.D. Vance, I noticed. I know how much we were trained to say and do the right things when we're on air and what we could say and couldn't say, and so we developed a certain comfort with being on air. And I think when J.D. Vance, when people talk about how good he is on air, how good he looked at the debate and how professional it was.
So he's doing it for a living.
It's because we were trained to do that. And you don't think of Marines being trained to do that, but we were the Marines who were trained to do that. So it kind of fits that he's so good at it.
I didn't know that's where we were going with the show, Tripp. I had no idea. That is one of the more fascinating 5 minutes, 7-minute opening of a show. All right, but you got to bail out of here. So why don't you give me the last question of this segment?
I think, how did it prep you for what you're doing now? I mean, take that?
So, I didn't want to be a photographer. I'm one of the few people I've always said who's been doing photography for my entire life, and I never chose it specifically. And I was trained to do it, and I was kind of a natural at it. I was good at it. And so I pushed into that, trying to master it. And so because it was traditional back then, it was a trade, right? It's not a trade anymore. It's kind of mistreated now. It's kind of not disrespected.
Yeah.
The reality
is, it went from a trade to a service. It's perceived as
a service.
A plumber is perceived as this is a trade. You can go through advanced to different levels. There's a master plumber. This is a service. Anyone with a camera is a photographer.
Exactly. Right. And the problem
everyone with a wrench is not a plumber.
Exactly.
Well, some think they are, but less often. Yes.
Right. And the problem is all the objective nature of what's okay to do and not okay to do was lost in that process, and it became this subjective art form that people could just kind of throw in the air and say, well, that anyone can do that. But objectively, there are rules that define proper use of like how photography should be created, right? When you're making a movie, there are character arcs, things you have to learn that you can learn in order to make sure the movie's done right.
Exposition, right? Isn't that the word that defines it? The exposition that goes behind something?
Yes, yes. Right? Like in a movie, the character has to grow throughout the movie or it's not effective. So it's you're gonna see that happening. Well, in photography, there are certain things things about composition. There are certain ways to control light. There are certain things about controlling light, ambient light specifically, that you can't, the camera just absorbs what it gets. And if it gets bad quality light, there are ways to override that and control that. But if you're just treating it like an art form and you're not learning how to control light from a technical standpoint, when you lose that technicality, it lost its respect and it lost its value. And it was very sad to see that go.
Wouldn't you say, though, a lot of things went through a similar transition when they went to the digital world, when they left the analog, where you are responsible for that feel and that tactile? I mean, look, I liken it to stick shift. When you drive stick shift with a car, right? If you love driving, you don't want to drive an automatic transmission. You want the connection to the road. And
but
Mike
mentioned the word manual. He mentioned the word control, though, and I think that's the difference. And there are ways to control your setting, you know, how
white balance,
right? And a lot of things have become automatic. You know,
exposure speed.
You lose that control, and I think that's the difference between a professional and an amateur in many cases.
It's a huge difference. Control of light is everything in photography. I was able to go through multiple genres, right? I shoot publicity stills for television and marketing. I've been working on a couple shows on Discovery Channel, things like that for a while. I got in the movie industry because of my use of lighting. They recognized it, right? Because they understand it. I've also, you know, I've worked as a corporate photographer for back then BlackBerry in shooting their events, and then I've worked for Oracle. And then I've done commercial photography where I have current products on HomeDepot.com that I've shot products for them. And all of that, in addition to wedding photography, which is probably one of my favorite things, all of that was able to be done because I could transition between it, because once you understand lighting, there are overlaps between those different genres, and 1 + 1 sometimes equals 3 instead of 2 if you know what you're doing.
Right.
Yeah, that is a great opening. Oh my goodness, we covered the whole show. We gotta figure out what we're doing in the middle there. All right, so I will say that you covered a lot of stuff, but the thing that is most appealing and intriguing to me is a lot of people stop when they find the skill set that they like and in the field that they like, and they just get really good at that. What personally drew you to be like, okay, well, you know, now I've seen more, let's go to weddings?
Oh, that was easy, because in photojournalism, you're taught to capture the moment without interfering, right? So you have basically long, medium, close-up. You're trying to tell a story, and that story has to have an establishing shot, a wide establishing shot, much like a movie would start out that way. And then it moves into medium action shots. Then you get into close-up shots that might capture the feel of the day, the feel of the event, feel of whatever you're trying to cover. You're trying to capture the smells and the nuances and all the beautiful things that you experienced there in person in order for the person who sees the work later to kind of relive that, right, through your pictures. When I got out of the Marine Corps, I had a brief job with a television station. I didn't much like video, and so I kind of bailed on it. And I thought, well, gosh, if I'm going to do a part-time photography thing for now, I'm going to start doing weddings, because weddings I'm going to be following along. It's basically, back then, photojournalism weddings was unheard of. I literally called it that, and people would be like, what does that mean? I'd be like, well, it means I'm not posing as much. I'm basically telling a story. Now, conversely, you fast forward to 2024 or 2020, maybe it's actually coming back around again a little bit, that everything was about photojournalism photography, and now they're like poo-pooing posing. But the reality is, weddings and things like that, they need formal portraiture. They need the natural, authentic moments, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Like, you need all of it. So the reality is, you don't want to follow a trend. I never wanted to basically say, well, photojournalism is so popular right now, I'm just going to, that's all I'm going to do, right? No, I always stayed kind of multifaceted in controlling that light, and I was able to move between genres. That's what kept me alive.
I love it. The biggest part about weddings is, like, I never looked at my wedding video ever again. I look at the pictures all the time.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? Like, you see more because the video, I mean, what are you going to make, a 2-minute video that just speeds up? You missed that.
Right.
You can catch more in a good posed picture in an action shot than you will watching the whole video.
Right. And I think the whole idea of storytelling is one that we'll dive into when we get back from the break. So you've been listening to the Marketing Madmen on Extra 106.3, and we'll be right back.